we're in the post-Trump era now, and while I don't agree with many of Donald's policies, I think one thing he's done is made it okay to challenge some of this bullshit. And I think people are starting to now get back to the kind of conversations they used to have before all this woke stuff took over and made everyone silent. And I mean, it's just like, how did we get to this stage of bullshit in the world of work? And I think everyone is just relieved that it's over.
Welcome to This Isn't Working, the podcast for employers and employees who think it's time to talk about the failings of workplace culture and how we can do better. I'm your host, Tanya de Grunwald, an HR commentator who's watching, listening, and hopefully asking the right questions. Okay, let's get this working. Hi, everybody. So today we're going to talk about what happened a few days ago at the launch event of my new business network called This Is Working. What did we learn about the current mood and direction of UK employers, and what can employees and the broader public expect to see from UK businesses as we head towards what looks likely to be a turbulent 2026? It was primarily an event for business people, but I actually think it's really important to bring these groundbreaking conversations out into the open. And in a way, I think people have a right to know how these conversations are progressing, as employees and the public are impacted themselves when organisations make mistakes as a result of poor policies and practices around people, culture and leadership. I'm joined this week by two business bros. I'm not sure if that's a compliment. The first is Paul Sweeney, former FTSE 100 Chief Strategy Officer, who regular viewers will know from the episode, Are Activist CEOs Out of Control? He's also an author and researcher into workplace nonsense. Thanks for coming back, Paul.
Yeah, it's great to be back. Thank you.
And the second is Patrik Schumacher, who is principal architect at Zaha Hadid Architects, the visionary team behind some of the world's most spectacular buildings. So thank you for joining us, Patrik.
Pleasure.
So let me just outline what the evening was all about. So at this event, I brought together around 50 people, including business owners, senior leaders, lawyers, HR people, risk people, recruiters. They were primarily private sector, although everybody was welcome. The event was kindly hosted by the private investment firm Ruffer at their lovely offices in central London. So thank you to them for the room and for the drinks. And our special guest speaker was Alex Edmans, finance professor at London Business School and author of May Contain Lies, who's also been on this podcast before. So the title that I gave him for this was there ever a business case for DEI? More about his presentation shortly. So I just wanted to explain what I was trying to achieve with this event. I had the vision for This Is Working about 2 years ago, when I started to understand the depth and scale of the challenge that I think UK employers are facing around people, culture and leadership. The only difference is that I thought this would be a network primarily for HR people initially. And there are two reasons why I decided to broaden out eventually into business people more broadly. And one is that although there are some excellent HR people out there who know that a lot has gone wrong here, I don't think there are enough of those people who have grasped the scale and urgency of the problems that organisations are facing. And by the summer just gone, I was starting to see far greater enthusiasm from private sector business people more broadly, who seem to have a much tougher, more commercial focus and also a much higher tolerance for discussing things that many people still consider to be pretty taboo topics. The second reason for my switch away from HR towards business is that it's become clear to me that although HR deserves a big chunk of the blame for some of what we're seeing now, particularly, thinking about things like employment tribunals, all the speech policing, all of this stuff, I do think that creating the mess that we're in now has been a team effort. I don't think it's just been caused by strong activists. I think it's also been caused by very weak leadership. I think there's also blame to go to bad lawyers, dozy risk teams, lazy recruitment teams, controlling press offices, and many, many more. I'd also like to give a special commendation to the conference industry, which I think has completely collapsed as conference organisers are now charging attendees and speakers and we're all wondering why the quality of these presentations is so poor. They're double charging as far as I can see. So discourse has kind of died across industries, I think. So there's plenty of blame to go around, and I think currently it's all falling between lots of different stools. I would say another great example of how it's sort of co-production, this disaster area, has been the number of employers who are still grappling with creating genuinely single-sex spaces and services which align with the law, despite the Supreme Court ruling in April, which clarified that we've never had self-ID in this country, and we certainly don't now. This really seems to be a mess, the making of which has been between HR, legal, compliance, risk. All of these people, senior directors, haven't got this right. So if we've all had a hand in creating all these problems, I think it follows that we're all going to need a team effort to find and to implement the solutions. And I think it was really powerful to bring all these people together. I don't think it's ever been attempted before, and things did get pretty lively at some times. But I think these are conversations that we frankly should have been having 5 years ago. So I guess no wonder people had a lot to say. I'm going to go over to Paul. What were your overall impressions of the evening, just from the group that was there? Did it feel like a watershed moment in some ways?
Yeah, and I mean, I think the first thing I'll say was a lot of fun, but also it was just great to have so many different perspectives in the room. We talk about diversity, and what we had there was a diversity of cognitive and experience, not a tick box diversity. So we had people that had a lot of experience in the legal field, in the HR field, in risk and compliance, and in business leaders of various kinds. So I think that diversity was actually great. It felt like also, it's like we're in the post-Trump era now. And while I don't agree with many of Donald's policies, I think one thing he's done is made it okay to challenge some of this bullshit. And I think people are starting to now get back to the kind of conversations they used to have before all this woke stuff took over and made everyone silent. And you could really feel some of the energy in the room, but also some of the just being fed up with it all. And a highlight, I think, was the lady from one of the big four accounting firms who described how she'd been asked by an aromantic young employee not to mention the fact that she had a husband and children at work because that might be offensive. I mean, it's just like, how did we get to this stage of bullshit in the world of work? And I think everyone is just relieved that it's over. But I do think you're right. We need to find a good way to navigate out of this mess, and that will need those perspectives. So risk, compliance, HR, leadership. It does require those disciplines to come together and have a sensible conversation about it. But it was also good to see humor is allowed again, and you can challenge and have some fun.
Yeah, I was certainly pleased that, frankly, lots of people turned up. I didn't know. I mean, I didn't. It was great, but I didn't know all those people were going to turn up. It was a Tuesday evening in November. Lots of those people have only seen me on LinkedIn, or they might have seen the podcast, or they knew me through somebody like this. I really didn't know, and I was really pleased the number of people that turned up. And I think you're right. I think there is a dearth of places like that. Mm-hmm. People are still saying that even within their own organisation as well, they can't talk openly. So it is nice to feel people coming together. I wanted it to feel really above board, and that's why I'm really grateful to Rafa for hosting it, because I really wanted it to feel like this is a legitimate conversation that, frankly, as I say, we should have had ages ago. I didn't want to have it, in some grotty room above a pub, people turning up wearing a disguise and pretend, not giving me their real name or any of that nonsense. I really think, as you say, I think we're kind of past that. And I think the private sector, particularly, we're bolder than that. We just kind of like the sorts of people that were in that room, they're just kind of over that stuff.
And general feeling of, let's just get back to work and doing what we're supposed to do, creating amazing buildings, or, giving great service, or innovating new products. But what happened to actually doing the work? Let's get back there.
Yeah. There was a sign that I put up saying there's a photographer at this event. Let us know if you're camera shy. And I wondered how many people had said to the photographer, I'd rather not be in the pictures. And I asked her this morning, and she said nobody. And they were all fine about me, recording it to create a report, which I'm going to do from it. And, I just felt there was that air of confidence in the room. Patrik, I'd like to start by asking you. You're known for having some quite sort of strong views, aren't you? What appealed to you about the idea of coming together with other employers in a place where you can speak freely and frankly about what's going on lately?
I just heard things which seems incredible, which we are not having in our organization. So we're just starting, and we're already stopping before we're starting properly. But what I've heard in terms of, recruitment process, excluding white males specifically, and then trying to search in our subgroup I mean, and what I heard was for me kind of saying, wow, thank God we never went down this route. It was very interesting to see the different voices and that there seems to be a convergence not to go any much further with DEI, or maybe rather pulling back and pulling away from that.
From DEI?
DEI. And we had been recently we are just starting a DEI kind of process, which we have then interviewed a number of consultancies, and I found out that a lot of these consultancies were founded in 2020 when we had the George Floyd incidents, and this seemed to have a big impact on UK employers and how they see their role in society and how they interact with their people. And frankly, I never quite understood why that should have an impact. And for me, the whole movement was always a bit alien and not a disconnect relative to the experience we have in the company. But since there was a groundswell of interest, and we wanted, inverted commas, late in the game, catch up and understand and meet the standard industry standards, etc. It was curious, though, in the interactions when we were in the selection process, we had some kind of groups which were aggressively pushing anti-white supremacism, critical race theory. There was pushing notions like meritocracy is just an excuse to discriminate, etc. So we had a bit of a run-in, and they didn't go very far in the selection process. One of them is really working very well with us, and they had a previous life pre-DEI, which was more like corporate restructuring, corporate development, and that's what they're doing now for us. We have 60 nationalities. We have 500 people. And we are totally indiscriminate about who is coming in. We want to, by the way, we need to tap into the global talent pool. So I don't like any of this current kind of anti-immigration flavor coming from the politics. I've been with the company since my student days in the late 80s, and we never had an issue, and we never will have. And so the whole thing is a red herring, left, right, and center for us.
Okay, we'll come back to the group discussion, which we had in the second half of the evening, in a minute. But let's just spend a few minutes talking a little bit about the keynote speech, which was by Alex Edmans. So the title that I gave him for this was there ever a business case for DEI? And the reason I did that was because I think that's a really good place to start for private sector employers. We've got all muddled up with this, is it the right thing to do? All of this kind of stuff. But we thought originally that there was a business case underpinning it. If there isn't, then we're kind of in a different realm now where we need to start saying, well, if we're not doing it for business reasons, and if there's unintended consequences that are actually really bad business, then what are we doing this for in the first place? So that's what I asked him to dig into. I'm going to go over to Paul. Do you want to maybe just talk us through what stood out for you? And then Patrik, maybe you can chime in
Sure.
after Paul's run through that. Yeah? Okay.
Yeah. Well, I think Alex, by the way, Alex was fantastic, and I enjoyed his presentation and learned a lot from it. But I think Alex, it's really clear from the discussion with Alex that there was never either an empirical or a conceptual grounds for a business case that said improving the demographic diversity of your leadership teams will lead to better business performance. McKinsey's appalling research in this space, which they've continued to sort of repeat every year and double down on. It's just, quite frankly, it's shocking. It's methodologically ridiculous. It's completely biased, and it continues to be quoted even in the FT recently in some award-winning article. But I think it's really, really clear that there is no empirical basis for that assertion. So, in terms of a financial performance business case, it doesn't exist. And the other thing is that we defaulted to a very simplistic view of diversity, which was demographic diversity. And Alex made the strong case that that's completely flawed in any sense, and that there's a much stronger case for cognitive diversity in the workplace. And that includes thinking styles, different experiences, introverts versus extroverts. It's all the kind of things of which demographic diversity can be a part, but it's clearly not the only thing. But then the other great takeaway from that was, it kind of chimes a bit with the research I've done into other things at work, which is we always want simplistic answers. very simple, tidy answers. But organizations are not simple or tidy. They're messy and complex and human. So even though there's a strong case for cognitive diversity, it's not a silver bullet and it's not easy to get the best out of it. It can lead to issues with group identity breaking up. It can lead to issues with affinity. It can lead to issues with inclusion if you're not careful. So it's not a simple thing to just say, right, let's just double down on cognitive diversity and everything will be great. It requires thought. It requires subtlety. It requires effort and thinking in order to make it work.
I mean, what stood out for me was, the emphasis not only from Alex, but also in the audience, and that to empower free discourse, and in this sense, diverse voices and perspectives uninhibited, and usually that is also the reflection. Leaders, successful leaders, love that, want that, and want to encourage that. And that's one of the main aspects also of our cultural upgrading, that we want to break through and break up some kind of negative side effect of hierarchies you need in the end in terms of management and responsibility taking, but to have something much more bottom-up, collegial, and information and critique flowing up the hierarchy. And that is something we doing systematically and finding ways of empowering staff, and 360 reviews, and also shifting teams if you're unhappy, and encouraging that. I think that came through also, that this is a general theme, and it's simply part of this where, inverted commas, truly progressive cultural patterns are, there's a business case for it, and you instinctively know it. In the knowledge economy, it's a new type of self-directedness in work, participatory decision making, and to gather the information. It's no longer command and control like it was maybe 60, 70 years ago.
I think what struck me was how far we've wandered from productive workplaces where people can speak freely. I mean, honestly, how often are colleagues being actively encouraged to challenge plans and decisions, or to stress test ideas and projects before they go any further? I mean, maybe it's happening, and maybe I'm just hearing from the worst kind of, from the worst from employees at the worst organizations. But what he was describing about, bosses that say to everybody, right, we're not moving forward until someone disagrees with me, for example.
This is extremely important, that we have people who speak up in the project, in the reflective directors group or SMT, and we need to encourage this. And and this, I somehow feel this kind of hypersensitivity gets in the way, because what I used to do and would like to do, I would just kind of call on people, put them on the spot, draw them out. And I've used to do that in teaching, and I had my seminars, and put people on the spot and challenge them, and this was new, and this was maybe in the kind of 2012, 2013. I was doing that in an international European graduate school setting, and I hadn't come across this kind of Vogue thing, but there was somebody from the US in the audience, and I did my thing, which I thought was always loved and productive, and she got charged at me, got angry, and accused me of bullying from the pulpit. Because I wanted to have a frank two-way conversation. I said, whoa. She killed the seminar.
I had a similar experience, Patrik, when I did a semester of my MBA 20 years ago in the US. And in London, the class discussions were brilliant. And people used to just say, "You're full of shit. You haven't got a clue what you're talking about." And when I did that in the US, it was just like the whole place went silent. It was just so funny. It's like no one is allowed to publicly call anyone out. If we're not careful, we'll get to a point where every challenge is now called bullying.
By the way, also, I mean, if you bring an international crowd, I mean, let's say Indians, Russians, Ukrainians, Latin Americans, Chinese, from all sorts, and Middle Easterns, that Vogue thing isn't, I mean, they're not participating in this, so we don't have that problem.
We were just talking about that idea of, more junior staff being able to voice their opinions and dissent. And I sense that might be easier in an organization like yours, Patrik, but in some other, in large service organizations where you have many layers of middle management, there's some evidence to suggest that being disruptive or in a constructive way is quite career limiting, because it's very hard. It's not welcome often by those middle management layers who are more focused on marketing themselves to senior management.
And that's what the role is of senior management, to bust through that. And that's what I'm working on. I mean, on an organizational level, through mechanisms, you're right. I mean, that's of course a tendency.
Yeah.
So one of the things that struck me about what Alex was saying was that there have been even more downstream effects from what we might loosely call DEI, and I guess the sort of safetyism and the inclusion and what some people would call woke than I had realized. So I was thinking about, like, if you get the message that you're not allowed to speak up about the nutty diversity, gender diversity, particularly training that people have been receiving, or some of the race stuff, about, white supremacy and stuff, even though you're working in an organization which, seems pretty reasonably well run, if you get the message you're not allowed to question that, then I think it's not that crazy that people would also get the message that they shouldn't also speak up about the fact that they think that this project is a mistake, or that the person who's been chosen to run it isn't the right person to lead it. So it just kind of like creates that general feeling. Do you know what I mean? And that I think is almost more damaging in a way for businesses than people having to sit through some nutty training and then they don't really think anything of it and they don't challenge it because it doesn't really make a huge difference to their lives. But I think there's a sort of, don't you think it's a sort of poison that comes in that way?
Yeah, and strangely, as recently as 2 or 3 weeks ago, one of Alex's colleagues at London Business School pushed out a view on LinkedIn as part of a conference replay. So basically said, if a high performer in an organization resisted any DEI initiatives or language, that they should not be promoted. And I think that's an astonishing thing to say from an organizational professor at a prestigious business school, given all that's happened. It's just, I just couldn't really believe it myself.
No, I don't think performance ever trumps culture. If your culture is important to you and it's strong. I understand that it's an easy thing for me to say, but I think if your culture is important to you and inclusivity and belonging is an important part of your culture, then I don't see how you can promote someone, because as soon as that happens, the rest of the organization says, well, apparently this doesn't matter anymore.
It's also really important that people sort of come to the office or start their work every day and feel that this is a place where they belong, that they feel that they don't stick out, that they don't have to not bring all of themselves to work every day.
Values are two ways. Your personal values should also align with the corporate values majorly. And if a person believes that actually the company has moved along in a different way, they will speak with their feet.
So that message that goes out is just, it's just terrifying. Actually, I think it's really terrifying.
Alex spent some time talking about psychological safety, didn't he? And how that term has got about 9,000 different meanings now. Anything from wrap people in cotton wool so they never hear anything that, that might upset them, to just say whatever you want, doesn't matter about offending people, and whether we need to be something in the middle.
The point is this, that if you discuss ideas, and we should distinguish if I'm harshly, or let's say, if I'm undermining bad ideas, I'm actually in a counterparty. I'm actually liberating from their bad ideas, and it's not meant to be ad hominem. It's respecting that individual enough to say, I have something you might want to listen to, and I'm not holding back, because the frankness of my argument on your idea, which I want to pull out of your head to respect you more, already respecting you, out of respect, I want to pull all these bad ideas out, drive them out of you, and that shouldn't be an offense. And that's the problem, that this is taken. So the heuristic needs to be that we need to trust each other, that we're not at each other's throat, we are at each other's bad ideas, and we want to share insights. And that culture has also been not happening in architecture. I've been struggling there as well, where you cannot criticize a student or the work of the student rather. If you criticize the work of the student, it seems as if the kind of you're undermining the student. No, you want to elevate the student. But that's been, there have been kind of some ongoing, toxic culture in universities where in the end, what you end up doing is flattery. You also can't hold back, because then the learning isn't happening. Then it has to also sink in for, a little bit. So, and it's not dishing out insults. Absolutely not. It is critiquing work, critiquing ideas, and that should never be taken ad hominem. You have to take things by what you said, not making a hypothesis that you actually only saying this to, because you're racist or you want to undermine me, or you're male chauvinist, or you are whatever you are.
I'm not sure how we got here when there's so many books about leadership. How on earth we've got to the point where we don't know the difference between insulting someone and, scrutinizing their idea and giving them helpful feedback. I do not understand how on earth we got here. This seems completely mad to me.
Agreed.
Right. Let's move on. I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the discussion that we had as a group after that. And I know that, Patrik, you have some strong thoughts, and I know you outlined some of them about the Equality Act and about employment legislation more broadly, and who would be impacted particularly if we just scrap the Equality Act, which is something that I hear coming from some voices at the moment. When I went to the Reform conference, I heard it. How does that fit with your perspective and your role as a senior leader in your own organization?
I'm somebody who is pro-market. I love freedom, economic freedom, and that's why I'm very critical of the way the urban development market is kind of shut down in the UK. But also economic freedom, free contracting. For instance, we discussed employment law and things like the Equalities Act. And these encroachment of ever more, and recently now under Labour, further sharpening of employee rights, etc. I don't think that's helpful. That's actually becoming a friction and a problem within the organization. And as I said, the Equalities Act becomes maybe an excuse for people who can't quite perform. It's an easy way out, an easy way to kind of scare us as well and put us on the back foot. And even if in any corner of the organization somebody is having problems with in terms of their work commitments, performance, etc., and they just have to kind of drop in the word discrimination, everything is kind of stopping in inverted commas, and we have major board meetings packed with lawyers and scratching, and the HR department. How are we going to navigate this? What are the steps and stages? And I think that's so way out of proportion. So I've been saying in the meeting that my rough estimate from our organization, 99.9% of cases are without merit, and there's an abuse of these conditions. In particular, it comes in 2010 when as far as I'm concerned, maybe not everywhere around the UK, but in the kind of, let's say, knowledge economy, professional workplace situations, there is no discrimination. And I also can verify that when it comes to gender issues, for instance, we are now have asked to publish and measure in a very particular way gender pay gaps. And if you measure it in this particular prescribed way, what we have to post a gender pay gap. Now, when you look at deeper and make correlations with years of tenure and status levels, and more finer grading, and not in major chunks, this gender pay gap altogether disappears. Younger female staff actually have an advantage. And we also measure the speed of progression, which is also equal, or rather saying that the ladies without children are progressing the fastest group. Then come men, and then a little bit behind is women with children, but also men with children. So there is no basically the whole thing is again a red herring, and also that what it should be, and because we are paying an enormous amount of attention every year when it comes to both promotions and to salary increases, we're turning every stone 5 times because the antennas are super sensitive, and you need to compare and rank, and you have to get this right. And any influx of any other criterion where you say, shouldn't we bring in more the women forward, or what about ethnic, would, and as far as I'm concerned, destroy any organizational rationality, because you then end up with superior inferior relationships, which are potentially inverse of the skill and charisma and natural leadership positions. And then you would have informal organizational relations trumping formal organizational relations, and the whole organizational structure would be meaningless, and you would undermine organization. So that's where we're super sensitive, and we know that we don't have discrimination, and if we detect it, we would eliminate it. And by the way, we don't need this to be legislated.
So do you think in that way it was almost odd to tell the private sector that they needed cognitive diversity or any kind of diversity because they already do what's best for the business? And
yeah, I do think so. I mean, it is an inherent deep interest of the leadership in particular, and everybody in an organization, that we weed out discrimination, because that's in the way of getting the work done, getting the best people in front. It undermines organizational structures. The formal structure would be undermined. So we don't need to be legislating any of that. And if you look back, and I was saying that under capitalism and business are the ones who have been always undermining any attempts let's say, to legalize discrimination, whether it's an apartheid regime in South Africa or in the Jim Crow South. We find business undermining and working against that, and employing people out of these pools which were discriminated against, and that would be the business case. So that law has to be kind of squashed right away. And if you wanted to, what we would do in free contracting, we could put in that we demand of our employees not to discriminate, and if they do, we can have a discipline against them. I wouldn't probably even do this, because the people we are hiring are not prone to be discriminating on those levels. But so I was saying squash and throw out the totally unproductive and counterproductive Equalities Act, but in the same time was saying rip up all of employment law and shift to free contracting.
Okay. Well, we did say that all views are welcome, and that's the whole point, is to get these conversations going. I mean, I'd say you're one end of the spectrum, and you made your points, and some people pushed back, and it was all pretty good natured. But I think you're not alone in feeling there have been a lot of unintended consequences from the Equality Act. Particularly, I know there's lots of concerns about the Employment Rights Bill coming in, so I wouldn't say you're a lone voice in terms of having any concerns about those things. And I think the private sector does seem to be leading in those discussions, because a lot of these plans that are put in place are done so, I think, with good intentions. People might disagree, but it's only when you're actually running an organization that you run into the sharp end of this stuff.
Well, I don't think the MPs who bring these things on have a clue, because they're not employing, they're not in private business. So I think they just go for some kind of things which look good and look caring, and they don't know what they're doing.
We didn't reach a conclusion on that one, but I think we got to the point of saying, actually, we're talking about, throwing out the baby with the bathwater. What would actually happen if we scrap the Equality Act? Who would be impacted? Who is protected? Is it causing more harm than good, or is there still more good than harm? So that was kind of the debate that I thought we were having. I think there was some interesting stuff from the recruitment people in the room about some of the requests they'd had from clients or from employers to sort of try to reach targets, and the sort of things they were being asked to do to kind of engineer the playing field, basically. And there was a headhunter there who said particularly that he had been asked, he wasn't a headhunter particularly for diverse groups, and I know that there are some such headhunters that exist. Borderless is one of them. Green Park is another one. Are there any others, Paul, you'd like to mention that have made a lot of money?
I think they all did at one point. Yeah. And actually, for doing things that were actually helping companies to break the law effectively.
But I think they would say that it wasn't illegal. Because they would say that the responsibility lies with the employer to make sure that they interview a wide range of people and they don't discriminate. So this is about, we've got a senior role and we want to fill it, and we'd really love it if a successful candidate was not a white man. AKA, we're not going to hire a white man. And if you, as the executive search firm we have chosen, find us loads of candidates, you will be more likely that your candidate will be successful if you present loads of women or ethnic minorities, or even better still, ethnic minority women.
Yeah.
And then also there was a gentleman in the group who shared that he gets a fee whoever he places, whoever the successful candidate is, who he finds for his client. But he gets a bonus fee if that person happens to be ethnic minority or happens to be LGBT. And I have to say, I wasn't really aware that this was happening on LGBT until he said this. And he said that it makes a difference for him of between 10 and 15 grand sometimes on top of the fee that he's already getting for placing this person, because the headhunters get 30% of the person's annual salary typically, sometimes more. So it can make a huge difference as to whether this person that you found who's a successful candidate is the guy gay or not, frankly. He found himself in a position where he had found the successful candidate and he didn't know what to invoice the client because it depended on whether the guy was gay or not. And it was like, what are we doing? And then, of course, he didn't actually tell us how they ended up finding out whether the guy was gay or not. But I mean, talk about an awkward conversation that's frankly none of your business.
But isn't that nuts? The whole thing.
Nuts.
Yeah.
And
And I do think it is illegal discrimination by the back door. And it's been happening, I think, at board level in particular. I think this has been going on for a number of years now. And I think there will be consequences because I suspect that people that were more qualified in many cases weren't being appointed. Headhunters to me are in the same bucket as management consultants. They're just Ponzi schemes and, don't really add much value to the world of business or the world in general, I'm afraid.
There was also a bit of talk about early careers, which is also my background, and talk about programs like 10,000 Black Interns, and also about things like contextual recruitment, where have we been lowering standards for young people from various backgrounds, bearing in mind that they got their academic achievements from coming from a more difficult background, from a rougher school, that kind of stuff. Should we ever have been doing that stuff? Even if we were just giving them places on a training scheme based on that, if the training scheme then gave them an advantage when applying for a paid job, even if it's the right side of the law, is it the right side of the sort of ethical line? Possibly not. And also we talked about how difficult it was to push back on any of this stuff. I think particularly for women as well, how many of these decisions are made within HR and how there is such a strong culture of this be kind, I'm doing that in quote marks, and how difficult it is for people, especially women, to push back on other women and say, hang on a minute, I'm not sure about this stuff. And I think also because it was so political, and I think Eric Kaufman, who actually came to this event as well, he made the point that we've got to see all this stuff in a broader political context, and particularly race and sex and LGBT, how taboo challenging those ideas has been. All this stuff about oppression and privilege and, white supremacy and blackness and all of this kind of stuff, all the trans stuff, it's been incredibly difficult to push back on. And people who have pushed back on it, you've seen what's happened to them. So it wasn't like it was a great advert for anyone else to speak up. It's all very well saying to people, oh, why didn't you speak up? And it's like, well, I just saw that woman get kicked out. I'm not going to do the same thing. Why would I do that? So I think we really need to remember what a strange period we're coming out of here. Thank God we're coming out of it. I do think we are coming out of it. I actually left the evening with a huge amount of hope that we are kind of emerging from it. And I actually think we are at the forefront of it. I think the private sector is at the forefront. And I don't even know, maybe the UK is at the forefront. I think we probably are in terms of talking about the gender ideology stuff particularly. There was a lot of discussion in that room. It wasn't being unkind to anybody, but it was more like, this is nuts, what are we doing? It was more like that. If there was anyone who was offended by that, they didn't speak up. That's all I'm saying. And maybe they were there. Maybe there were people that had trans-identifying children and they found that conversation very difficult to hear. If they were, they didn't speak up and they didn't email me afterwards. So I felt like what I got from that was generally people are moving away from these sorts of ideas as facts. And now not only are they contested, but they're also, some of them, they're going, yeah, this has been a bit nuts. Why are we tripping over ourselves to get the right pronouns for people? And this thing about, this woman that had the aromantic colleague who told her not to, could she not talk about her husband and her children, please, because it was offensive. As you say, I think people are just kind of over that stuff. So I felt like there was quite a mood shift in the room. And funnily enough, I didn't think people weren't rude or offensive. There are people in the audience who weren't white, all from all different backgrounds. My friend George Fielding was there. He's a wheelchair user. We had a great conversation about disability, actually. Actually, I'd quite like to come on to that because I think I was pleased by how much time we gave to disability, and I think that was totally right, and that had been really ignored and downplayed in DEI, because it's not one of Eric Kaufman's kind of holy trinity of sort of taboo issues. So, and I think there was a big reaction to actually what George Fielding said, about this idea of people self-identifying as being disabled, and about how much oxygen had been sort of snatched away from people, particularly with physical disabilities, and had been kind of conflated with mental health and neurodiversity and even the trans stuff as well, and how difficult it was for people like him, and he's a bit of a lone voice, to be able to say, no, hang on a minute, we just want to talk about disability here. Mm-hmm. And I think there was, I just feel like if we'd spent half the amount of money that we'd spent on, frankly, Pride, which I see no evidence this was A, needed, or B, has created any positive results. If we'd spent half the amount of money that we've spent on Pride in the last 5 years, if the employers had spent that money on disability instead and class, how much of a different place we'd be in now. And I think it's to our shame that those conversations have been squashed out. Did you have any thoughts about the disability stuff, Paul?
Yeah, I thought that was a really eye-opening conversation for me, because I didn't realize how much air had been sucked out of the debate for people with genuine physical disabilities. And yeah, there's the whole notion that everyone's now self-identifying as disabled on a whole huge swathe of, random things, basically. And actually that we are spending more money on that than people that have a genuine, proven, physical certified need, as opposed to a self-identified, idea. We need much more debate on this. This needs to be much more public, I think. And we need to be really talking about this.
Yeah. What did you also think about the woman who talked about from a risk perspective? Because I was asking why at large companies, they have a risk department. There'll quite often be a chief risk officer. And I'm like, what the hell are these people doing? Because this DEI stuff is really high risk. And actually she gave us as her example, she was talking about I think it was about single sex spaces and the number of employers who were still getting this wrong, and how she'd been raising it for some time, particularly in terms of the getting that wrong being a breach of the 1992 workplace regulations, which actually can result in up to 2 years in prison for directors who are responsible for getting that wrong. So she said there's a whole there's a whole load of legal risks, people risks associated with these things, these kinds of policies and initiatives. And she says, I think the root of it is really bad corporate governance, because who gave HR the pen to write the policies that aren't even legally compliant? Mm-hmm. And she said that in terms of people risk, she said it's not seen as a big enough risk, despite all the tribunals, despite this thing about directors' liability. She says that it's not seen as what she calls one of the sexy risks, which she said things like cyber risk, market risk, and credit risk are seen much higher. And she said when you start talking about the risk from HR policies, that risk people's eyes glaze over. So which is obviously not good. And she said these sorts of issues are not coming to risk committees, and they're not being talked about in risk teams. So again, I would say this is not just HR. This is what's gone wrong there. Like, how are those conversations not coming up, particularly given the tribunals were saying not just around all the trans stuff, but race, it comes up with race as well, and disability as well. What do you think?
I mean, where you see the organizations with the biggest risk teams, they're in regulated industries like financial services, and they are very, very much focused on things like conduct risk, financial risk, risk of money laundering, all that kind of stuff. They are not at all interested in risk around HR and people. They never give it a second thought. It's not in their remit. And what she was saying is right, is that, the decision to give HR the pen on some of this stuff has been absolutely nuts. And it does need to I think it does need to be elevated now as a significant risk. The risks are coming from HR policies around things like trans inclusion, around things like DEI, that are in some cases illegal, and they're putting the organizations at risk of prosecution, and at risk of the directors spending time in prison.
There shouldn't be such risks. That's an artificially politically created risk. And, if people become a risk, that's already a wrong starting point.
Well, things like, for example, if you're Virgin Active, if you're Virgin Active Gym and you've been running a sort of self-ID policy in your changing rooms, and you've got male-bodied people using the women's changing rooms, and then you've suddenly you've been thinking that was fine, that was never actually fine, and it's definitely not fine now. But whose responsibility was it? Because if something nasty had happened in one of those changing rooms, that's a significant risk to the organisation, correct? And even after the For Women Scotland ruling, they had to be really, really pushed, I think, by Sex Matters, the campaign group, to change that policy. And it's like, that should be, consider. I would imagine that's a huge risk. I mean, it's pretty obvious that men are going to want to go into the women's changing rooms, and at some point something nasty is going to happen, or one of the women's going to sue just because they feel uncomfortable because it's gross. Like,
I think it's going to be hard to get away from corporate responsibility for things like that, especially when you have a policy that's created that risk that wasn't there before.
Yeah. So there were several lawyers in the room as well. One of the things we talked about was whether the Equality Act was the problem, or whether it was the implementation of the Equality Act that was wrong. And again, we didn't get to the bottom of that. We're not going to solve that in one evening. That's a huge question. But he was talking about how the focus of the Equality Act and what it was originally designed for, the focus has really been lost. It was supposed to be particularly for people with disabilities, particularly for pregnant women, for example, and that suddenly it's going to people with ADHD who are finding it difficult to do X, Y, and Z. And that's not really, those are individual cases that should be solved by employers, and it's just not really what the Act was intended for. Actually, he mentioned the For Women Scotland case as well, and he said that's why we saw in the For Women Scotland case, eventually we get back to some sanity, which is, men are men and women are women, and you can identify as whatever you want. And if you're genuinely transitioning, you have a separate characteristic of gender reassignment, but that doesn't mean you can self-identify into any category you want. So, and he didn't get any pushback on that kind of thing. So I think for this group, it's quite a fringe view now to disagree on that particular ruling.
I was going to say, because if we don't push back on this stuff, there's no limit to where you end up with. If I self-identified as a giraffe, does that mean Patrik has to raise the ceilings of all his buildings? Where's the end to it all?
Yeah, I mean, that's one example, but also things like people saying that they have anxiety and depression and those sorts of things, and they're sort of almost self-identifying as having a disability.
If you have a kind of unnatural surge in numbers, that has no objective basis. It's subjective. It's hype. It's abuse. Whatever it is, it's not real. In a fundamental way, it might be subjectively induced, and it's an easy excuse, and then you believe in yourself and all the rest of it. But this mental illness epidemic is, that needs to be deflated. That bubble, that's nonsense, and that means it would disappear if it doesn't come with a lot of privileges, rights, and free money. That makes no sense to me.
I know you've talked about how what you would call woke has been damaging for architecture as an industry. Could you just talk about that very briefly? Because I just think it's interesting.
Well, yes. I mean, the academic elites, let's say, or professions have always been more tilting to the left. Architecture, I guess, in particular, because it's a kind of old legacy where the governments and states and public authorities were clients, major clients in the Europe, nearly the only clients in the up to the 70s, let's say. And there's kind of a lingering, and also the heroes of modernism, which still are weighing heavy on our shoulders. They have been growing up. The discipline has been kind of reinvented in the 21st century under the auspices of a centrally planned economy, nearly, or when it comes to the built environment, physical planning, and so that's the legacy. So it's a heavy on the kind of statist outlooks. And of course, woke is gone around everywhere, from universities. Of course, the English departments were first, and social sciences and so on. But it arrived in architecture with a vengeance, and it took over everything, basically. So to the point that, particularly when it comes to the, let's say, discursive arenas, whether it's, of course, universities, whether it's biennales and cultural conferences, exhibitions, curatorials, staff and magazines, that's all the attention goes into the global south, into marginal communities, favelas, and social justice issues, which architects who have to earn fees would never actually even touch. So, and that means the actual work which goes on has no longer critical discourse accompanying it. And that's bad, because that means we are degenerating back into a craft rather than into a discourse-led and, let's say, theory-led and critically argued for solutions. And within the discipline itself, and the professional discourses, like only one topic, which is also kind of has a kind of vogue thing, obviously, because it's this kind of moralized discourse on sustainability. That's the only thing professional conferences are talking about. I'm literally saying 100 out of 100 conferences, literally.
Really?
And
Wow.
and that means
Wow.
no, we're only talking about carbon footprint, a cost element, which for the most part is also largely engineering driven. So that means also there is a kind of big vacuum machine sucking all the discourse into that narrow band, and therefore again leaving bereft the discourse on, you know, the benefit side of things and how the solution space. And also to do that, of course, in a country like England, this coincides with the planners basically doing all design decisions, land use plans, densities, the different components of functions in their quantities. And once you go into residential, the unit mix, how many 4-bedroom, 3-bedroom, 2-bedroom, the size of every room, and then they prescribe the facade. Ought to be some kind of ever smaller windows, use a brick facade, and that is basically leaving tiny kind of margins. And for the developers, as urban entrepreneurs, they have also nothing to innovate. And that's why I said architecture as an innovation, theory-led and discourse-guided, innovative discipline has ceased to exist. So we're witnessing the end of architecture.
Yeah, it's funny that, I mean, it's been so difficult to push back on, and clearly you're.
Well, I knew I had my demonstrations outside my office, literally at class war with posters, my face with a Hitler mustache. Literally, I had, I had to see out of which gate I would come out of the other. They chased me down the road. It was a running match.
Wow.
With their posters, they couldn't quite catch me, but that's, and a huge kind of smear campaign, and I hate the poor and all the rest of it. I mean, snippets of that lectures captured and thrown on YouTube, and this spread through some. That was enough. It was tough. Actually, was tough because it rattled a little bit. The organization. Am I interfering with business for the company? This was 2016. It has been going on for years and years in architecture.
As we draw to a close, I want to talk about something that happened, which involved you actually, Patrik, during this event.
Oh yeah. I wanted to say that.
So there was another flashpoint. So the two flashpoints I would say were this issue about the Equality Act and an employment law, whether we should get rid of it all or not. As I say, we didn't reach a conclusion on that one. And the other one was that it was more like the fact that it was you, Patrik, who was bringing up some of these issues, particularly around equality. And you made quite a bold statement, frankly, which is that there's no such thing as discrimination, which I have to say, I think you probably knew was going to go down, would prompt some kind of reaction. But the reaction that you got, and I don't want to talk about who said what, but the reaction that we got was based on, I can't, coming from a white man, basically was the reaction from one person in the group. And yeah. I was sort of, and I know that particular person who I've known for a long time.
And I got a very robust defense from somebody else.
And I thought that was really interesting. I thought it was interesting, and it really showed that this is not 2019 anymore. And actually, you can't, if they had a response and a rebuttal, which actually several other people did after that moment, and several other people did challenge you, and you took it in good nature and all the rest, there was no problem. But if you want to dismantle somebody's point and say, actually, Patrik, you're talking absolute nonsense and I disagree with you, then you can't base that on the fact that you happen to be a white guy. That seems like that's not going to fly anymore. And I was actually quite pleased about that, I think, in a way, without wishing to be unkind to anybody in the room. But it just showed a little bit that I think people who think that kind of argument is still acceptable are kind of 5 or 6 years behind everybody else who's paying attention. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, completely. And it was almost like it felt really odd in that room that came out and then everyone just went, yeah, that's just, there was no support for that remark.
I guess the question is how are white men welcomed into these conversations in a way that it doesn't feel to the women and ethnic minorities like racism and sexism are being denied? Because I do think racism and sexism do exist, and a lot of people in the room will have had those experiences. And so to expect them to not have a reaction, even an emotional reaction, I think takes some extra work on their part. And I'm not sure quite what the solution is. I mean, it is very annoying when, obviously I'm white, but it's very annoying when people sort of say, oh, it's just as easy for women as it is for men. And then I'm expected to come up with, examples at my fingertips about several moments in my life, which I may or may not feel like sharing with people I hardly know, where it really hasn't felt like it's been even at all. It's been pretty unpleasant or whatever. So I think there is, conversations are getting much more robust, and I think everyone's going to have to toughen up, and I totally agree with that. But I also think, on the other hand, we need to be careful to figure out how we're going to talk to each other in a way that doesn't feel like we're being offensive. And I didn't think you were, Patrik, at all.
There's 2 points here. I think one is, yes, we have to make sure that in the conversations that we're not pretending that racism and sexism don't exist, because they clearly do. But at the same time, we also have to move away from automatically invalidating someone's opinion because they're a white man.
Yes.
I think, and that's the tension, I think, in the discussion.
Look, what I would say, it of course in different milieus and in different parts of the country. I mean, first of all, in the UK, it's maybe the least racist and sexist. And in certain milieus, it disappears nearly altogether. If you go into university and class or whatever, and in time, it is disappearing more and more, of course. And in the younger group, women are making on average more than men. They're moving faster, etc. And at a later stage, in the high echelons, who was arriving and so on, I would not attribute this to discrimination at the workplace. It might due to the private relations and decisions because of the general kind of cultural pressures, which men, I feel, quite strongly in terms of your ego, in terms of your self-respect and being respected. If you are, let's say, following the career path of your wife, and look, I get the new generation will get there.
It's a whole other can of worms.
Well, I'm going to wrap up now. Was there anything else that either of you wanted to say about the event, or about how you're feeling about where employers are generally, and whether these conversations are at least beginning? It sounds like you're both saying you're encouraged that these conversations are beginning to happen. You seem to agree with me that the private sector is where it's going to lead on this. We need more conversation. We need to talk and talk and talk, right? Would you say that, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's just like, after a brief period of madness, we're kind of coming back to a place where common sense is becoming normal again.
Yeah.
It's Okay. But these conversations are very helpful, I think.
I mean, it's it must be the public sector is not going to reform quickly. We in the private sector, we have to perform. There's a profitability measure, and we're in a competitive environment. And if the whoever is leading in that backlash and charging forward, this will be healthy. This will be the tendency. I think in the public sector, they don't have to perform in the same way. They're not these competitive and strict measures, and they can kind of stay lingering in this process. And it's not only this particular woke and DEI stuff, that they have other. I mean, I've talked to public sector people, particularly the ones who are ambitious, who have to put teams together. Let's say the Foreign Office or similar organizations. They are worrying about colleagues, retiring on the jobs, and people don't show up to work. I mean, the average attendance, I mean, we bring, after COVID is less than 2 days, etc., etc. So that is tough for somebody ambitious in which they do. People who have the sense of public service and want to do something in the public sector. I mean, we should bring them in. We should have them in the next meeting.
There is one other thing about, and actually it is important, because at the interface between the public sector and the private sector, you have got often procurement from the public sector, and so much of this woke stuff filtered through into the criteria for procurement And something needs to be done about that, I think, fairly soon.
No, it's very heavy. There should be only one criterion, which is performance, putting the best team together for the job.
Where possible, I'll try and bring them into the podcast as well. This isn't working, because I actually think if the private sector can lead on this, I think we probably can drag the public sector with us and the charity sector. They will all start to see what we're doing, and whatever they're doing is going to look increasingly nutty if they're not starting to modernize and move with the times. And I think, we're going to have increasing political and cultural and social change in this country anyway, I think, next year and in the following few years. And I think I can see that in a year's time, we're going to be very, very grateful that we've got this community of employers. Well, it seems to me like we just scratched the surface on, when we all met up the other night. And I think there's loads more to talk about. I think it's just the very, very beginning. I'm going to be running more events in the new year. If anybody who's listening wants to offer us a space, and some drinks would be even better as well, to host these events. It's turning out to be a sort of thought leadership group, really. And as you say, it was actually really good fun. And I think it's exactly the kind of healthy conversations we should have had years ago. So we're going to have lots more of those.
I love it. I mean, I'm stuck my neck out, and we had a kind of Chatham House rules, and now we're in the public, and I'm welcoming anybody to kind of carve into me, slice me, dice me, both, and also looking forward to the backlash from my own people, my own company, my own colleagues. Let's see what. Let's bring it on, guys. Bring it on.